You surely won't believe that a simple act could change someone's life. On a regular flight, when Barron Trump, the son of a famous family, gave up his first-class seat for an elderly war veteran, no one could have expected that this small gesture would lead to an emotional and surprising story. What happened next? Did that act really create an unexpected change? Follow this story, and you will soon realize that sometimes the smallest things can make a huge difference, making our lives more meaningful than ever before. The light in the airplane cabin flickered slightly as passengers slowly settled into their seats. The morning air at Washington International Airport was filled with anticipation and the chaotic sounds of the flight preparing for takeoff. The flight to Newark, departing at 2:47, was fully booked. Amid the bustling crowd, a young man sat in the VIP section, his appearance unremarkable unless one paid close attention. Barron Trump, now more grown up, tall, with a tough and reserved demeanor, sat by the window, his face buried in a book, as though trying to avoid attention. He didn't like standing out, but the name printed on the boarding pass couldn't help but attract attention. Meanwhile, an older man, with silver hair, walking slowly, and a face marked by the passage of time, entered. He wore an old military coat with medals that had tarnished over the years, but still exuded a rare sense of dignity. As he walked by, some passengers couldn't hide their admiration, whispering to each other about his glorious past. He chose a seat near the back of the plane, between a busy businessman talking about work and a noisy child constantly fidgeting. It wasn't until the airplane door was closed that the atmosphere became tense. The elderly man's companion, seemingly dissatisfied, began requesting a seat change. This situation caught Barron's attention, and he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the scene in front of him. Looking at the military coat, something inside him stirred. Without saying a word, he pressed the call button for the flight attendant. "Could you help me with something?" Barron asked gently when the flight attendant approached. "I'd like to give up my seat for the man in the military coat. Is that possible?" The flight attendant was momentarily startled, her face showing a brief look of surprise. Passengers in the VIP section all looked up, their gazes a mix of curiosity and admiration. Barron's action was completely unexpected, especially for a young man in first class, a place where everyone was accustomed to privileges that were never challenged. But his attitude showed no reluctance or hesitation. "I'll check on that," the flight attendant replied, her voice slightly faltering at the unexpected decision before quickly walking toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood up, his seat gently shifted, and soft whispers began to spread. A woman sitting across from him couldn't hold back and leaned toward him, her voice filled with concern. "You don't have to do this. You paid for this seat. Maybe you don't need to." Barron simply smiled softly, his eyes lighting up with an unusually calm expression. "Sometimes, some people deserve it more," he said, his voice steady yet full of emotion. When the flight attendant returned, her face mixed with surprise and admiration. "The man has agreed to switch seats," she announced, her voice trembling, full of emotion. "Not everyone can do this, especially when it's a young man. And with a name like yours, everyone notices." Barron Trump stepped out of the airplane cabin, his steps steady, even though he could feel every eye on him. Whispers began to rise, and many exchanged glances. Some even raised their phones, wanting to capture this special moment. But he paid no mind to those looks, focusing only on a familiar figure at the back of the cabin. As he approached, the elderly man looked up, a hint of surprise and confusion crossing his gaze. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a bit hoarse, yet still full of determination. "You don't have to do this. Really?" Barron smiled, saying nothing, just bending slightly and extending his hand. "Thank you for what you've done. I just want to help," he replied, his voice calm but sincere. The veteran couldn't refuse. The honesty and sincerity in Barron's eyes made him rise. Despite his hesitation, he reached out and took Barron's hand. A warm handshake that seemed to convey all his gratitude. "Thank you, son. This is something good I never expected," he said, his voice choked with emotion. As Thomas entered the first-class cabin, all eyes turned to him. The passengers continued to whisper and gossip. A woman sitting nearby leaned over to her daughter and softly said, "Do you see? He gave up his seat for him, such a noble gesture." Next to them, a middle-aged man glanced over, still a bit in disbelief. "I've never seen an act like that on a flight," he murmured, almost as if explaining it to himself. Barron sat back down in his seat, the cramped space no longer bothering him. He adjusted his position to make himself comfortable, ignoring the attention of the others around him. His eyes were absorbed in the book he was reading. A flight attendant passed by, stopped beside him, and gently asked if he needed anything. Barron just shook his head and continued to bury himself in the pages. He needed nothing more than a little peace in this cabin. In the first-class cabin, veteran Thomas sat in the plush leather seat, leaning against the armrest with a smile full of surprise. This was a sensation unfamiliar to him after years of sitting in stiff seats. A flight attendant gently approached and handed him a thick blanket, along with a cup of hot water. "You deserve to be treated this well," she said, softly but with great respect. Thomas looked at the comfortable seat in front of him, then back down to the economy cabin, where Barron still sat silent but steadfast. His heart warmed, not because of the amenities around him but because of the small yet meaningful gesture from the young man. He silently thought, the world sometimes still holds many acts of kindness. While passengers in the economy cabin were busy with their daily activities, their eyes kept drifting toward Barron Trump. There he sat, a young man at peace, while the story in first class slowly unfolded into an emotional picture. Veteran Thomas sat silently by the window, though his exterior still held strength. The marks of time couldn't hide the hardships he had endured. His lips were pressed tight, but his hand resting on his thigh trembled slightly. A wave of emotion suddenly surged within him. After a long while, he turned, his gaze softening as he looked at the woman sitting next to him. "Did you know?" he began, his voice soft but sure. "The young man sitting over there. It was his family that saved my life once." Catherine Miller, the woman with a kind gaze, looked at him curiously, raising an eyebrow. "His family?" she asked, not quite understanding what he meant. The old soldier bit his lip, a sign of an unforgettable pain. He slowly adjusted the metal on his jacket, took a deep breath, and then continued, his voice deep and filled with longing. "In the 1960s, when I was in the Vietnam War, I was seriously injured. My knee was shot twice, and I could barely stand. When I came back to America, I was completely lost. No home, no family. I went to New York, hoping to make a living, but no one helped me." His voice trembled, but he kept going, not stopping. "Back then, I was sitting outside a diner, with nothing in my hands except a few coins. Suddenly, a man walked up, not hurrying past like everyone else. He sat down with me, said nothing, but listened to my story. That man was Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father." Catherine looked at him, unable to hide her surprise. "Fred Trump?" she asked, her voice showing clear astonishment. The veteran nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "Yes. He didn't owe me anything, but he did something no one expected. He didn't just give me a little money and walk away. He helped me get a job, gave me a place to stay. 'You've served this country,' he said. 'That's the least we can do.' And I'll never forget those words." His story quickly caught the attention of nearby passengers. and a silence enveloped the first-class cabin. Eyes met, and his story began to spread. One of the flight attendants approached, gently asking, "Would you like me to tell him this story, sir?" The old soldier paused for a moment, then gently shook his head. "No, let him keep some peace. He doesn't need to know how important this is to me right now." Silence filled the first-class cabin. All eyes were on Barron Trump, the young man sitting in the economy section, completely unaware that stories about his family were stirring deep emotions in those around him. The old soldier's tale was like a miracle, rekindling care, selfless kindness, and the unseen connections between people. What seemed like an ordinary flight suddenly became a space filled with profound emotions. After the old soldier's story ended, the atmosphere in the cabin became quiet, as if his words still echoed in the air. The passengers silently looked at each other, some of them bowing their heads in contemplation. The flight was no longer just a simple journey, it had turned into a meaningful conversation. A long while later, the man sitting across from the soldier, in his 40s with eyes showing weariness but a sense of closeness, spoke up. "Sorry to interrupt, but you've really moved me," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "My grandfather was also a veteran. He told many stories about the importance of the people back home, the ones who always cared, even with the smallest gestures. What you said about Fred Trump reminds me of the stories my grandfather used to tell. Indeed, acts like that are hard to find these days." The old soldier looked at him. His gaze softened, then smiled faintly. "You're right. Sometimes it's the small things that can change a life. I once thought I wouldn't be able to go on, but it was that kindness that helped me find a reason to keep living." The woman sitting nearby, holding her sleeping daughter in her arms, spoke up, her voice soft but full of empathy. "My father used to say the same. He wasn't a soldier, but he always said that even the smallest act, like a simple "how are you" or a pat on the back, can make a difference. That's why I think what Barron did today really means something. Kindness, even small, is always precious." The old soldier's gaze softened when he heard these words. "Of course. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures, but just the feeling of being seen and understood that changes everything. Fred Trump did that for me. And today, his grandson is giving me the same feeling." The atmosphere in the cabin began to warm up, like a wave spreading, connecting everyone through shared emotions. A flight attendant, clearly unable to contain her feelings, sat down next to the old soldier, her eyes shining with emotion. "I wasn't going to share, but my brother was also in Iraq. He never talks about what he went through, but when he came back, he said that the moments when people stopped to thank him or help him, even in small ways, made him feel that he wasn't alone. That was what kept him strong during the difficult times." The old soldier listened, his face filled with empathy. "That's right. It's those small things, those touches of spirit, that help us continue when everything around us seems to be collapsing." Barron, from the economy class, saw the different looks directed at him. Some people couldn't hide their surprise and gratitude in their gaze. Though he didn't fully understand the story unfolding, he smiled gently and nodded to a woman who gave him a warm smile. That simple gesture, though small, changed the entire atmosphere of the flight, creating unexpected connections. The old soldier turned to the flight attendant, his eyes lighting up as if recalling something very important. "I've always believed that gratitude is something that never stays on just one side. It continues. It spreads. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life. And for all these years, I've tried to live in a way that honors what he did. And today, Barron reminded me of the importance of that. Life is wonderful, isn't it?" At that moment, the plane shook lightly as it passed through some turbulence, causing everyone to sway a little. But the atmosphere in the cabin remained steady. The conversations continued, like a release of shared emotions, as each passenger felt a deep connection through stories of kindness, empathy, and life. As the plane began to head toward Newark, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin became strangely quiet. The old soldier sat still, his eyes gazing out the window as if searching for something in his memories. The air was filled with anticipation, the passengers not speaking, but their eyes meeting, sharing unspoken emotions. The captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling that the plane was about to land. At the same time, the flight attendant approached Barron, who was sitting quietly. She slightly bowed her head and then looked into his eyes, gently saying, "Did you know? The person you gave your seat to, he just shared a very meaningful story about your family? I think you should hear it." Barron looked up, his face unchanged, but something sparked in his eyes. "Of course," he replied, his voice calm but with curiosity clearly present. The flight attendant continued softly. "He talked about your grandfather, Fred Trump. Back in the day, when he was struggling in life, your grandfather stepped in to help without asking for anything in return. Today, you're doing the same for him, and it made him remember those beautiful memories." Barron looked at her for a moment, as if those words were slowly sinking into his mind. He didn't rush to respond, only gave a faint smile. A smile that seemed to carry a bit of unease. "This is really special." The flight attendant nodded and then quietly walked away, leaving Barron to ponder. Everything that had just happened felt like a mark on his soul, making him realize that sometimes unconscious actions carry weight beyond our understanding. When the plane landed, the passengers stood up, preparing to exit the plane. But unlike other times, the old soldier didn't go straight to the door. He turned around and walked toward the economy class. He scanned the seats, his gaze stopping at Barron. The young man was standing to grab his luggage, and when he saw him, a look of surprise appeared on his face. The elderly soldier moved closer, his hands extended with a sincere attitude. "You moved me. You didn't just help me today. You are continuing a tradition in your family. Your grandfather's kindness. It can never be forgotten. And today, you helped me complete a cycle." Barron looked into his eyes, his gaze softening. Then he lowered his head and shook his hand firmly. "I'm just doing what I think is right," he replied, his voice gentle but certain. "You deserve it." The cabin of the plane was silent as the passengers watched the scene unfold. Some could not hold back tears, quiet tears of emotion flowing, while others simply looked at each other, understanding that what they had just witnessed was priceless. A miraculous connection between two people, one young and one old, separated by a generation. Yet kindness had erased all gaps. As passengers began to disembark, many stopped to shake Barron's hand, thanking him for his small but meaningful gesture. Some also approached the elderly soldier, expressing their gratitude for his dedication and sacrifices in life. When they reached the door, the elderly soldier turned back once more, his gaze filled with respect as he looked at Barron. "You have a beautiful heart. Don't let it fade. Always remember that small actions sometimes carry immense power." Barron stood still, his gaze gradually softening as he felt the depth of those words. As he walked towards the baggage claim, he took out his phone and wrote a short message. He paused, looked at the screen for a moment, then pressed send. The message read, "Grandfather will be proud of today." It was a story about the ripple effect of kindness, about the unspoken connections we unintentionally create every day. Small actions can create profound change, not only for ourselves but also for those around us. Keep sharing stories like this to remind the world that kindness can still change everything. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to share it with those around you to spread the goodness. Subscribe to our channel today so you don't miss out on inspiring and meaningful stories. Every video is a new journey, an opportunity for us to explore, learn, and connect. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to always be the first to enjoy these wonderful stories. Thank you for joining us. This is just a fictional story, created for entertainment and to convey meaningful messages. All characters and situations in the story are not real, but we hope that the messages about kindness, empathy, and humanity will bring moments of deep reflection to you.